Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive geopolitical earthquake, how one incredibly narrow waterway literally brought global trade to a grinding halt in early 2026. We're diving deep into the 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis, visually dissecting the events that completely upended international shipping and energy markets in just a matter of days. Let's kick things off with a pretty wild thought experiment. What happens when 20% of the world's oil just stops moving overnight? Well, as we saw in 2026, it's not just a hypothetical anymore. When a primary artery of the global economy gets severed, the shockwaves don't just stay out at sea. They hit your grocery store, your gas pump, and your heating bill. So let's map out exactly how this whole thing unfolded. Here's our roadmap. We'll start with the spark of the crisis, move into the choking of the strait, and look at the ships caught in the crosshairs. Then we'll cover the global economic shockwaves, the dual blockade, and finally, the fragile standoff. All right, Section 1, the spark of the crisis, and the initial actions that set this all off. It all kicked off on February 28, 2026, with coordinated U.S. and Israeli airstrikes on Iranian targets. This was a severe escalation, and the response was incredibly fast. Within hours, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, started transmitting radio warnings to vessels in the Strait of Hormuz. By March 2nd, the IRGC confirmed the strait was closed to passing ships. And then by March 4th, they claimed total operational control over the seaway. Imagine the sheer panic rippling through the maritime industry as this unprecedented escalation played out in just 96 hours. To really grasp the stakes here, you have to look at the numbers. Historically, this narrow passage between Iran and Oman handles about 20 million barrels of oil every single day. That is 25% of all global seaborne oil trade. Add to that 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, or LNG, and 55% of other maritime trade. When a choke point like this closes, you aren't just delaying some cargo ships, you are literally starving the global engine of its primary fuels. Which brings us to Section 2, choking the strait, and the specific tactics of closure. Now, the IRGC didn't just string a giant net across the water. They unleashed an overwhelming mix of asymmetric warfare tactics. We're talking 500 to over 1,000 speedboats rapidly swarming commercial vessels. They planted hidden naval sea mines, essentially creating a deadly, invisible minefield. On top of that, they used satellite spoofing and GNSS jamming, meaning ships' navigation systems were completely blinded or hijacked. Add in direct drone and missile strikes from land and sea, and you have a heavily layered defense. These tactics are relatively cheap and easy to deploy, but incredibly difficult and expensive to counter. But here's the thing. The blockade wasn't just physical. The invisible force that really froze commercial traffic was insurance, specifically the withdrawal of protection and indemnity insurance starting on March 5th. You see, even if a brave captain wanted to risk navigating the mines and the speedboats, the ship owners just couldn't afford it. The area was declared a high-risk zone, and war risk premiums absolutely skyrocketed. Without that crucial maritime insurance, the financial liability of losing a massive oil tanker is just too catastrophic. So the strait became a place that was legally open in theory, but completely closed in practice. Let's look at the human element in Section 3, ships in the crosshairs, and the human toll of the crisis. When we focus on a few specific incidents out of the 60-plus attacked ships, the real-world danger for seafarers becomes heartbreakingly clear. On March 1st, the oil tanker Skylight was struck by a projectile, and tragically, 2 crew members were killed. A few days later, on March 4th, things escalated environmentally when the Senangol Namibe was hit by a sea drone, causing a major oil spill near Kuwait. And then on March 11th, the Mayuri Nari caught fire and ran aground. Despite rescue efforts by the Royal Navy of Oman, 3 seafarers lost their lives. These definitely weren't isolated events. They were part of a massive, terrifying wave of strikes on commercial ships. And the sheer scale of the disruption is staggering. According to the International Maritime Organization, the immediate fallout stranded roughly 20,000 mariners and 2,000 ships right inside the Persian Gulf. Just try to put yourself in their shoes for a second. You're on a cargo ship, your route home is suddenly blocked by an active conflict zone, your supplies are dwindling, and you have literally nowhere to go. Now let's shift gears to Section 4, global economic shockwaves, and the resulting global market panic. To see exactly how this standoff hit your wallet, look no further than this number. $126. Brent crude oil surged to a historic high of $126 a barrel. This made it the absolute largest disruption to the global energy supply since the 1970s. To put that into perspective, March 2026 saw the largest ever monthly increase in oil prices in the entire history of the world oil market. When a quarter of the world's seaborne oil is suddenly trapped behind a wall of sea mines, global markets don't just react, they go into a state of absolute panic. But as you probably know, this wasn't just about oil. A massive 30% of internationally traded fertilizer was trapped too, which directly threatened global food production and drove up grocery bills worldwide. Beyond that, supply chains for liquefied natural gas, which is absolutely vital for heating homes across Europe, along with industrial aluminum and helium, were severely choked off. The ripple effects of this one single waterway closing spread like wildfire, hitting global agriculture, tech manufacturing, and basic everyday energy needs everywhere. Moving right along to Section 5, the dual blockade and the strategy of maximum pressure. By mid-April, we entered this incredibly tense dual blockade reality, where both sides were applying maximum economic and military pressure. On one hand, you had Iran enforcing a blockade of the Persian Gulf specifically against ships tied to the US, Israel, and their allies. On the other hand, after ceasefire talks in Islamabad failed, the US Navy stepped in with its own blockade starting April 13th, this time targeting Iranian ports to force them to reopen the strait. The geopolitical knot was basically pulled as tight as it could possibly go. The U.S. Navy even went as far as attempting to physically escort ships out of the Gulf. On May 4th, they launched Operation Project Freedom to break the gridlock and safely move merchant ships out. Iran immediately warned that this was a ceasefire violation. Interestingly, just 2 days later, on May 6th, the operation was abruptly paused. Why? Well, negotiators were reporting great progress toward a diplomatic resolution. So the whole situation was wildly swinging back and forth between military force and the negotiation table. And that brings us to Section 6, a fragile standoff and the eventual diplomatic breakdown. The reality is, agreements during this period collapsed almost as quickly as they were signed. Take the Islamabad Memorandum, for example. On June 17th, it really looked like a major breakthrough. A memorandum signed to end the blockades. But just 3 days later, on June 20th, Iran claimed the truce was violated because of ongoing strikes elsewhere in the region, and they immediately clamped down on the strait again. By July 8th, after a fresh wave of attacks on commercial ships, the interim truce had completely evaporated. In response to that total breakdown, international forces had to get creative. They attempted to carve out new, widened naval routes to bypass the chokehold. By late June, the Joint Maritime Information Center, overseen by the U.S. Navy, announced a new, wider route passing closer to Oman. This was a very direct challenge to Iran's control over the waterway, serving as a bold attempt to force a safe lane through the danger zone and finally get global traffic moving again. So, what does this all mean for us today? I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Are global supply chains simply too fragile to survive the next major choke point crisis? Think about it. A mere 34-kilometer stretch of water brought the entire globe to its knees in a matter of days, spiking oil prices to historic highs and trapping tens of thousands of seafarers. The 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis is a pretty stark reminder of just how interconnected and, frankly, how delicate our modern world truly is. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.